This is Jay Tolson at the Hedgehog Review at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. We're delighted to have Anna Keating with us today. She wrote a very thoughtful, provocative, and now widely read essay that appeared on our blog about a week and a half ago, wasn't it, Anna? And it's really been picked up, read, commented on widely by national press and commentators and pundits. And it touched a nerve quite clearly. Anna Keating is, among other things, the co-author of the Catholic Catalogue, a field guide to the daily acts that make up Catholic life. She co-owns and lives above the Keating Woodworks, a furniture studio in Colorado. She writes widely for publications like Salon, Notre Dame Magazine, Spirituality and Health, Church Journal, First Things, America, U.S. Catholic, and so on. Anna, welcome. We're delighted that you could make it here today. I know you're juggling many things, including 3 children, although that's probably not a very attractive metaphor of throwing children into the air and keeping them occupied. But we're delighted to have you here and willing to talk about this piece. I thought just to start what I'll do is I will ask Anna a few questions after she gives a brief overview of her piece, and then we'll open up to other questions, other participants. So Anna, would you give us, for anybody who hasn't read the piece, a sort of brief synopsis?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. I worked in chaplaincy at an elite liberal arts school. This school where I worked had a endowed fund for Roman Catholic studies. I'm a Roman Catholic author and essayist. And I went to give a book talk at the school, and the small Catholic community asked me to be their campus minister. They didn't have anyone to help them facilitate things like mass, community suppers, service projects, retreats, that kind of a thing. I said, sure, I'd be happy to do the job. I was excited to help support this group on campus. And I was also very committed to pluralism. As a member of the chaplain's office, I often attended other community events. Most of the chaplains on campus were interfaith and focused mostly on New Age and Eastern style offerings. We had qigongs and meditation, queer spirituality, yoga, that kind of a thing. So I really felt that I had something to offer as a member of the team, as a Roman Catholic woman, to support people interested in Catholic spirituality, either academically or spiritually. The community grew and thrived. It was a very diverse, probably one of the most diverse communities on campus. After Jews were the largest self-identified religious group on this campus where I worked. Catholics were the second largest group. But as the community continued to grow, I noticed that there was a lot of tension. I thought my job was to help this community flourish and grow. But as events got larger, masses got bigger, speakers were very well attended. We brought out speakers like Father Greg Boyle. I felt that there was a lot of pushback that I didn't fully understand, that a lot of people didn't want, that it wasn't good for the institution's branding to have a large, thriving Catholic community or to have a large, thriving Jewish community. Those communities were never featured on the campus's website, for example. And I was very concerned at times as to some of the pushback students received about their religious identity. I was very committed to helping students explore their identities, whether that was gender, race, class, sexuality, or religion. But this identity was seen as a bad identity to have. Students expressed to me that there were good and bad identities, and to be Jewish or Catholic on campus was a bad identity to have. Anyway, as I began to learn more about this during the same time, the campus was assigned to read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And those ideas were implemented in the campus's anti-racist implementation plan. I also read those books and studied them as we were all grappling as a country with terrible police brutality and anti-Black racism. When I was speaking to an administrator about how these ideas were being implemented, he said to me, this was someone very high up in student life, that chaplaincy itself might be considered problematic, that the college might want to get rid of chaplaincy, because if you take the idea of equity very seriously, if there are larger numbers of Jews or larger numbers of Christians on campus than there are numbers of Buddhists, Muslims, Baha'i, etc., is that compatible with the idea of equity, which is that the numbers on a campus should match the numbers in society more generally? I didn't realize that ideas that had to do with anti-racism would be applied to religion in this way. What this administrator said to me was that in order to be an equitable and anti-racist institution, we might need to get rid of Jewish life and Catholic life entirely, and to replace those kind of spiritual life groups with wellness, which was troubling to me, for one, because Jews have been recently the victims of genocide based on their race and ethnicity, but also because these were very healthy communities full of overwhelmingly progressive students committed to social justice and to anti-racism. They were healthy, thriving communities, rich sources of intercultural exchange. And I felt that the campus would be impoverished in a way by not having those kinds of identities represented. I also felt that wellness was not an adequate substitute for religion and what religion can contribute, especially since, and this is a whole nother article, the academic study of religion had also become a place where there were no professors who were themselves practitioners of any particularly religious tradition. So students who wanted to explore religious identities as living things at elite institutions were running into a lot of challenges. And that's kind of what the piece was trying to explore.
Thank you. Obviously, one of the things that was very striking about this piece is that you came to it, as you say, as a liberal, possibly even a progressive. These labels are hugely inexact and applied to all sorts of people and all sorts of contexts that have themselves become a big part of the problem of public discourse in this country. But I take from what you say in your piece that you can consider yourself sort of a classical liberal in most respects, that you're very much concerned about individual rights. You're even tending toward the progressive side of liberalism, that you found a lot of what you thought anti-racism was about congenial and worth supporting. But when it came to what we might call demographic tinkering, in order to arrive at sort of racial equities in institutions, you started seeing your liberalism fundamentally challenged. Is that right? Is that how is that an accurate characterization of what was going on with you?
Absolutely. I'm not a culture warrior. I came into this institution thinking that I would be a great fit because I am a liberal, and I was also the product of an elite institution. I consider myself a feminist, and I consider myself an anti-racist in the sense that I want to look at racism in American culture, in Christianity, in our institutions, and try to work for equality. So I thought that the project was about making sure that we had criminal justice reform, that we were talking about issues like unarmed Black Americans murdered by police, unequal funding for public schools, all these very important questions, racial bias in hiring, etc. But here I had a community of students who were very international, a huge number of first generation college students, many students from marginalized identities, excuse me, Latino students, Indigenous students, all of these students meeting every week for community supper in my home. A very, exactly what you would hope a progressive institution would foster, this kind of intercultural dialogue and exchange to talk about these very important issues of social justice, among other things. that kind of community being targeted in the name of anti-racism didn't make sense to me, and still doesn't make sense to me. There were just a lot of surprising moves being made that didn't seem to be necessarily about public policy, or even necessarily about changing attitudes.
I mean, I would say that it would come as no surprise that many of these administrative moves would have just the opposite effect, perverse effects upon students, particularly the students who themselves were feeling that their identities were undesirable, unattractive ones. But also, I think, on other students as well, who were wondering, questioning, is this the best way to create a kind of open, diverse, pluralistic atmosphere in a institution of higher learning?
Right. I don't think any of the students in Catholic or Jewish life wanted any kind of special treatment. If anything, with the funds we had in Endowed Fund for Roman Catholic Studies, I helped many students do projects, that were very critical of Roman Catholicism. One of the beautiful things about studying a religion is learning from its errors. One of the reasons I am a liberal Catholic, what that means to me is that I recognize that Catholicism has so often judged people based on their immutable characteristics, and kept them from positions of power. Think about women, for example. So often in Catholic thought and Christian thought, a woman's position was fixed and subordinate. She was not able to preach. She was not able to bless. So as a Catholic feminist, I'm very sensitive to any kind of racial or gender essentialism. But when Christianity was described as quote unquote Western or white supremacist, when this very diverse faith tradition was kind of put in that same sort of box, it was very confusing to me to see that, especially when the students in this community were very diverse, were from very diverse backgrounds. To kind of just talk about Judaism in terms of whiteness was overly simplistic, since many Jewish students had experienced intergenerational trauma. It felt like seeing a lot of the things on the left that had been so troubling to me on the right. So some of the trends that were so troubling to me in conservative religious spaces, to see them emerging in progressive secular spaces was very concerning to me, and was very difficult for students. So if you have students who have close bonds, I'm thinking of students of different races from different cultures who meet every week for prayer. These students consider themselves to be family, to be siblings beneath the skin. And then to have administrators say, no, those kind of friendships are not possible. It's very challenging to take an 18-year-old and say, you can't have this identity anymore because your religion, for instance, is colonialist. It doesn't allow the student to have the space to kind of explore whether or not they want to participate in the religion that they were raised in, to learn more about it, etc. It just kind of puts it in these neat boxes of bad or good. And religions are, of course, much more complicated than that. They contain both bad and good. There's no such thing as a pure religion. So I felt this particularly. These are the kind of questions that were coming up for students. Or do you need to kind of go through an ideological cleansing and no longer use the language of your parents and your grandparents and use a new moral language to describe your reality? Or can places like Princeton and Columbia be welcoming and tolerant, where you can be a valued member of the community who also has those kind of religious commitments?
I think one of the other, there are many aspects to this essay that are worth exploring, but I think one of the most troubling to me was the way, sort of what I would call administrative overreach. And, it's been much written about the sort of expansion and bloating of administrative sector in universities and other institutions. That in a way, what a large part of the life of the administrator is dedicated to is sort of managing and controlling areas of in this case, student life, which itself is a troubling thing. I mean, here I would say one would not want too much of one's life controlled by managers. But the direction of institutional life in our times, and not just in universities, is toward growing management of just about every possible contingency that might arise. In other words, the institutions are now sort of commissioned with the task of making sure that people stay in all sorts of lines in all sorts of areas. And that was the chilling aspect of what you related in your piece to me is, and I take it this was said quite explicitly, that we would like to have fewer problematic institutions and activities and more what you call very wittily Epcot Center type activities, sort of kind of feel-good cultural activities that don't get at the problematic or challenging sides of any faith tradition. And because these sorts of Epcot activities are more manageable, and not just manageable, but also they seem to be more oriented to deal with a kind of bland psychological wellness, a kind of therapeutic. I mean, again, it's another instance of the triumph of the therapeutic in our culture. The therapeutic is safe. You can manage that. So we want more of that. We will even try to eke out the therapeutic aspects of religious traditions. Could you comment on that rather chilling sort of episode when you were really confronted with that view?
Yeah, it's not coming from students. Students
know.
and desire intellectual diversity, and they love coming to these events. Shabbat was one of the most popular events on campus, and it was many non-Jews who came and thought, wow, what a powerful experience that was, that I would have never had growing up in my Cuban, for example, family. So it's not coming from students. It's not coming from professors as much as it is coming from administrators who want campuses to be safe places, by which they mean they don't want diversity of opinion. They don't want students to encounter uncomfortable difference. But many students want and seek out those uncomfortable differences because they understand that that's where learning happens. And that's part of what they're hoping for. Not every student, but many students. So yes, it's very paternalistic. It's very administrative. It's very surprising, I think, to most people who aren't in academic settings, how much power administrators have. Who is it hurting? Like, I'm not allowed to advertise for Mass, I was told by an administrator. Who is it hurting if these kids go to Mass? How is this harming other students if someone wants to pray in a totally unused chapel? Traditional liberalism says it's not hurting anybody. So there's a great fear that something is going to cause trauma or pain to another student because that student is uncomfortable with its existence. I am not hearing this from students nearly as much as I'm hearing this from administrators, and it's very paternalistic. Why this role of let me tell you what to do even with your free time? It's just an interesting change from when I was in college, with even your social time. That's one piece of it. And I think I maybe lost the second part of your question, but the administrative piece is huge. There's a lot of wellness comes from the corporate sphere, and there's a lot of corporate language coming into higher ed. So most of us think of college as an opportunity to get an education, but in many ways we're training future managers in the language that they will be using in corporate America. Wellness is very good for corporations because companies know that their employees make more money for them if they are drinking a lot of water and getting enough sleep and, wellness, right? Journaling, if they're in a good mood, right? I'm drinking water too. I'm going to be a better employee. I'm going to take less sick days. So it's very much a financial decision. In the same way, colleges know that wellness is important. If students are having safe sex, they're going to have less STDs, etc. This is a good thing for the institution. This is not the same as religion, and it cannot replace religion. But there's kind of this idea that we can do religion in a safe way in which it will be offensive to no one. But that's not what religion is. So religions make truth claims. They do things that people don't like. Even members of as a Catholic, my own religion does things that I don't like. There's no way to completely make religion safe. But there's a way that colleges want to do that in that same sort of corporate kind of way. And so you'll have monies moved from Shabbat, which is open to everyone, to a celebration of Dia de los Muertos, where you decorate a sugar skull. You get a cookie and you get to take it home. But to people for whom praying to their ancestors is a living, active, real practice, praying to the dead, decorating graves on All Souls Day, All Saints Day, going to Mass. This is not just a corporate kind of a thing. It's a living tradition. And it can even feel disrespectful in a way to kind of make it so safe that it's no longer recognizable.
Yeah. Well, one of the other interesting takes in your piece, it was, as I say, it was commented on by a number of pundits, including Ross Douthat at the Times. And he really made the case that in some ways, the position of a liberal Catholic, such as you, is an extremely precarious one. He tied your piece in with his discussion of the move by the German bishops to accept blessings of same-sex blessings. And he said, the position of the liberal Catholic is getting more and more precarious. Ross Douthat, obviously, claiming the position of a very conservative Orthodox Catholic. And so he used your piece almost as a sort of exemplum of the problems that liberal religionists have in this country, is that eventually they find themselves unable to satisfy the dictates of the ultra-progressive elements of our society. Is that your fate, you believe?
It is challenging. I think what I would say is it's challenging to be a centrist. It's challenging to be a moderate. It's challenging to be a person who wants to have dialogue right now in our country, to someone who truly believes. If you're a person on the right or the left who believes that error has no rights, you are having a good time right now. There are people who want to have you. And if you're someone who truly believes in dialogue, and intercultural exchange, that it's challenging. I would say for me, I consider myself an Orthodox Catholic, although also a liberal Catholic, so those words are a little bit tricky. But what I would say is that I would not have an easy time working in the Catholic Church, and I would not have an easy time working in higher ed, and probably won't do either again. The reason for both of those is a kind of identity essentialism, which is having a moment in our country. So for certain clergy, a woman is not something that they feel comfortable having in a leadership role. Sexism is real, right? There is a sense of, well, who is this person? You are not ordained, so what are we going to do with you? It's fine to kind of, set up and clean up. But if you actually want to teach and preach and have authority, there are some conservative Christians who are uncomfortable with that. In the same way, if you're in a progressive space and you are a Christian who believes that Christianity is beautiful or true or good, or in any way worth defending, there are many people who will say, no, Christianity is part of the structure of white supremacy. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about it as part of the structure of white supremacy. That's big in Kindy's own story. His family was in Black liberation theology and he rejects it. There's no version of Christianity that can be separated from white supremacy culture. So if you're trying to kind of be in these different spaces and to have these conversations, there are certain intolerant strains that say, you know, you have to check all of the boxes or you can't be part of this community. And what I would love for colleges to be is places where you can explore and you can check some of the boxes and you can ask these kind of questions. And I would want religious spaces to be that too, to be places where it's okay to ask those kind of hard questions about things like the role of women in the church or the church's racism, having these hard conversations instead of kind of an all or nothing kind of defensiveness or an all or nothing kind of criticism. Does that make sense?
Unfortunately, it does make sense. You know, it's both breathtaking and heartbreaking to hear somebody say that you don't really see yourself having a place in institutions of higher learning. I think that the heartbreaking aspect of that is that you might be right. I hope you're not. I hope that you find a place, at least occasionally, in such institutions. But if you don't, then I think, you know, we're on a even more terrifying trajectory than I sometimes think we're on. But I hope that the extremes of what you're talking about, including identity essentialism, which is one of the big factors. And I would like to sort of segue away from me and maybe do so via one of our participants, Malloy Owen, who wrote in our current issue a piece about aspects of what has come to be called critical race theory. And what I think Malloy Owen has done very helpfully is to sort of discriminate among different approaches, particularly that of Robin DiAngelo, whose book is now read everywhere, and other strains in critical race theory, some of which are valuable, useful in thinking about structural racism and so on. Malloy, would you jump in and sort of comment and question, and then we'll open up to the wider group.
Oh yeah, thanks Jay, and thanks a lot Anna for this really beautiful and informative piece, which really helped me to think about this stuff. I mean, I would say like, yeah, as for what I wrote, I mean, it was so we hear often this is kind of like the John McWhorter thesis that administrative anti-racism or sort of anti-racism currently is a kind of religion. And so when I went into reading DiAngelo's book, I sort of expected to find this, you know, to find some sort of simulacrum of religion. But in fact, I think what I found fit really closely, Anna, with what you have described in your context, which is that actually it's not really so much a religion as a management technique, and a very sort of, you know, social scientifically value neutral system of managing human beings and sort of getting them through life as smoothly as possible without these sort of bumps and jolts that are provided by the complexities of religious faith. So like one of the very striking things about white fragility is that DiAngelo is actually, you know, she's sometimes accused of trying to excite these strong feelings of guilt among the participants' intercessions, but actually, like there's a substantial part of the book that's devoted to a critique of the feeling of guilt. In fact, white fragility itself, this complex that she's attacking, is a kind of guilt. And so I think in an almost sort of like wellness kind of manner, right? Like DiAngelo actually is trying to sort of, you know, set us free from these complicated feelings that arise around racial interactions so that we can just sort of do this kind of flat bureaucratic and administrative work of reconciling ourselves to other people on a sort of operational basis, but without a really deep sort of human mutual understanding. So yeah, I mean, I was like, consequently, I was naturally really struck by one, like the idea of replacing all these religious activities with wellness, which is just a, you know, a far more sort of manageable and less complicated vision of helping people to be happy. And then also, of course, by this kind of convergence, which I think we're seeing in a lot of different places between administrative anti-racism and sort of the older techniques of administration, of bureaucracy that have been, I guess, gaining force in the university for some time, evidently. Yeah, I think maybe one question I have, Anna, if I can put it to you, is that Kendi, and this is in line with what Jay said, because I was trying to sort of distinguish between different forms of anti-racism. Kendi struck me as a very sort of interesting and complicated figure, because on the one hand, he does seem to have this very high regard for sort of cross-cultural exchange. I mean, he has the story, you know, this long sort of personal story that's interspersed through his book, where, you know, he as you said, he comes out of Black liberation theology, and then but also has these sort of great fulfilling experiences with the Black community, sort of wants it to remain kind of strong and vibrant, right, and to be insulated from the pressures of the, you know, the white world or something like this. And this seems admirable. Like there's a lot to admire there. But then at the same time, he also favors this sort of very simple, quantifiable standard, which is, you know, if you have even proportions of everybody in all your institutions, then you've solved the problem of anti-racism. And if you haven't, then you're racist. So it strikes me as this attempt to sort of flatten this complicated idea of living together into something that you can put into an Excel spreadsheet. Like, what percentages of people do we have in these different circumstances? So I don't know. I guess I myself have been trying to figure out, I mean, is this just a contradiction in Kendi? Is it just a contradiction in anti-racism, that on the one hand, it's premised on, you know, the richness of these cultures and all the sort of good, I think, like liberal cross-cultural ideas that you admire, but then on the other hand, it flattens into something sort of mathematical. So I don't really know what's going on there, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that. I enjoyed your piece as well. It's, if you grow up in a wealthy, white, progressive, elite community, if you go to a school like Dalton in New York City that costs $50,000 a year, you are very fluent in the language of intersectionality. This is nothing new for you. You are not asked to give anything up when you come to college. You've been checking your privilege. You've been using this language your entire life. If you are a person of color, if you come from an immigrant community, if you come from the Black church, in a way, there is a loss for you. Let me give the example of a student who, Black Protestant student who I got to work with, who was wonderful. She said, when I come into the classroom, she said, when I go home, my grandmother anoints me with oil. It feels so good, my grandmother's blessing. When I come into the classroom, my professor tells me, your grandmother is only a Christian because a slave owner put a Bible in her great-grandmother's hands. What do I do with this? Now, a white, secular, progressive student is not asked to renounce her parents, to give up her grandmother's blessing. It is the Black student who is asked if she can receive her own spiritual inheritance, if she can pass it on to her children without participating in white supremacy culture. That's the kind of, I guess the word progressives would use is violence that I'm seeing with some of this stuff, that you need to use the same language. There needs to be the same language to describe your experiences as the student who went to Dalton. You can't have difference. There can't be different ways to describe reality. This student might speak of racism in the language of sin. That language is not welcome in our classroom, right? So why not? She has a unique perspective. She has a unique set of tools. They're both committed to anti-racism and they speak about it in different ways. Why do they have to speak about it using the same language? And why is a predominantly white faculty member, it's a white faculty member telling a Black student what religion she should be, which used to be considered in traditional liberalism kind of a private matter. Again, I think there's this kind of tensions within certain strands of anti-racism. Another problem I had with that story, I shared it with white students at the college where I worked, is that all of them agreed with it. Yes, her great-grandmother, her grandmother is a Christian because of slavery. Well, For one thing, that denies the grandmother, the Black woman, her agency. No one is interested in asking her, why are you a Christian? What did the Black church add to your life? When did you fall in love with Jesus? It is because of white people that things have happened to you, right? And so some of that language from D'Angelo has real consequences, even if you haven't read D'Angelo, in ways that it's trickling down into the broader culture and saying, your grandmother was somehow tricked or duped, that she is not an adult woman who knows her own mind. I find that kind of thing very problematic and I think fairly called neo-racist, in that it doesn't have any interest in a Black woman's lived experience of Christianity or the role that the Black church played in the civil rights movement, being kind of erased. So those are some of the concerns I have with when you have a sort of a sense that everyone needs to be the same, that we need to have an exact proportion, that these thriving subcultures can't exist. These are some of the concerns that came up for me, and they came up from real experiences and real conversations with students.
Thank you. I know Kyle Williams, whom you worked with, Anna, would like to ask a question or two. So Kyle is our new associate editor here, so I'll take this occasion to Zoom welcome him. Kyle.
Thanks, Jay, and thank you, Anna, for this piece, and I really enjoyed working with you on it. I think there are a lot of questions that I would like to ask, but I don't want to take up too much of the time from others who I'm sure are eager to ask questions. But one thing that that I thought that stood out to me in the piece that I thought was quite compelling and that I identified most with was this kind of transformation, really, of the college experience, right? That's taken place not everywhere, not universally, not all the time, but in many of the elite sectors of higher ed. Of really, I would say probably the last 10 years or so, it's really been a kind of recent phenomenon, from thinking of a college experience as one of trying on new identities, exploring new things, having kind of semi-dangerous experiences depending on what you're into, either intellectually or physically, to something that's much safer and much more managed. And I'm just curious if you could maybe reflect on that in your own experience of college and how it seems to have changed. And it strikes me as, and as you say in the piece, a kind of impoverishment. And it strikes me as myself as a kind of loss, but I'm curious if you could comment on that.
I don't know how your experience was undergrad, but I didn't know any administrators. I pretty much knew faculty, I had my friends, and I knew staff, the women who worked in the cafeteria and people who helped me in the library. So the role of administrators in managing students' emotions and feelings and not wanting them to experience any kind of negative emotions, that's totally foreign to me. And then the way of doing class is totally new. I thought that the point of college was to be a Marxist at noon and the capitalist in the afternoon, that you were supposed to read each text and try to truly understand it. So the point wasn't to critique it because you were only 18 years old. It was try to understand it. That was the first job. So when you read Spinoza, you wanted to understand atheism. You weren't there to prove it wrong. You didn't know anything. The whole goal and dream of college was that you had 4 years to try to learn something. And that was okay to try on different identities, to say, maybe I am an atheist, or maybe I am an agnostic. And it was a process of exploration and a great privilege to be able to do that. And you recognize, at least I recognized, how incredibly privileged you were to have 4 years to be able to do that sort of thing before you had to get busy making a living, providing for a family, all of those sorts of things. And I think some of that has been lost. I knew there were colleges that existed where even asking a question that threatened the dominant view of things. I'm thinking here of fundamentalist schools like Oral Roberts. I knew there were schools like that existed, but I associated them with the far right, where you'd get kicked off of campus for having sex or converting to Catholicism or something like that. There were very strong orthodoxies. You had to sign a statement of belief. it would never occur to me that progressive campuses would be places like that, where a student couldn't say, I don't understand, it helped me understand, I don't understand this argument, I don't know how it works, without fear of being called out. So there's a very strong call out culture that's part of this. You're very much encouraged to call out and report your peers for wrongthink. But of course, when you're 18 years old, you know, that's just part of learning. You're going to think things that you no longer think tomorrow, especially if you're reading widely. And so I think all of us who are committed to liberal education want to fight this kind of a liberalism, because it's important to the process of learning, is the process of making mistakes. It's absolutely essential. And you have to have I can't believe I'm about to say this, but you have to have a safe space for trying on identities and for making mistakes. I think about it with my children learning to walk. All they do is fall over, you know, like if they just stopped walking, if they fell over, then they would never learn to walk, right? So that's basically what learning is. You bump into doors, you make all kinds of mistakes, especially as a teenager. We forget how young college students really are, and how new they are to living on their own, et cetera. And so not to put too much pressure on them, an undue burden to have it all figured out, to know exactly the right answer, that kind of thing, I think is really important to having a good, healthy college experience, where everyone can learn as much as possible about themselves and also about other people.
Okay, well, I think we'll open it up to others to ask questions. So either raise your hand if you're there in your square, and or you can raise your hand on the Zoom way by pressing Zoom, or you can write a question on the chat if you want to. But if in one of those modalities, as they say, please let me know that you'd like to ask a question. I'm looking around.
While perhaps people are formulating a question, I was curious. A very brief question was, what is the reaction been like to you personally with this piece? It was read widely. I'm curious if there was any reactions or receptions that were kind of interesting or surprising to you.
Yeah, thank you. I got some threatening emails, which I'd rather not talk about because that's not always fun, from people where I worked. But I also got an overwhelming and positive response, lots and lots of feedback, mostly from professors. It was interesting that most people shared this piece privately. It didn't do very well on social media, but I heard a lot of people say, a friend sent this to me in an email and I want to thank you for writing it. I heard from a lot of elite institutions, places like Yale. And I heard from a lot of fellow liberals who say, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, and I've seen these same kind of moves and a sense of fear in the classroom to talk about certain things. So thank you for writing it. I hope we can have a better conversation. So I got a lot of really positive responses.
If there is somebody who has raised a hand and I haven't seen it, please, Mary Butler, are you raising your hand? If so, please take off your mute. We can't hear you. I see your.
This is Laura Ford. I have my hand up in the
okay,
in the window, so yeah. I can.
Oh, I see. Yes, it was it was actually against a white background, so I had trouble seeing it. Sorry, Laura. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. So I just am very grateful to you for this discussion. Let me say I'm a professor of sociology, assistant professor of sociology at Bard College, so in the Hudson Valley, and I'm glad to be with a group of people talking about these important issues. From the administrative side, I guess just to be contrarian, I'll express a little bit of solidarity with the dilemma of administrators. I think part of what they're dealing with is the threat of litigation, and they're trying to respond to that. And so I can understand why they're responding in the way they are. And I do think that the culture that's happening right now shouldn't just be blamed on them. I think it's also about faculty and about the way that faculty interact with each other. But I wanted to ask for your advice as somebody who has been in the position of a chaplain. I'm a Christian. My background is Protestant. I think of myself as being ecumenical. And I have mostly thought that my responsibility was to keep my Christian commitments out of the classroom. That was not appropriate. But I feel like the culture is so embattled right now. And then do you think that Christianity offers and something that's, you know, the message of the gospel in good kind of Protestant language, but, you know, love and various aspects of Christian tradition, I think, are very relevant to the crises that we're facing right now. So one thought that I had was to start a reading group, because that would at least bring the discussion out of the classroom. But I wanted to ask you if you have any advice as a chaplain about things that faculty can do to bring Christianity in a way that's available to students without imposing it on students.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. And it is faculty too, so thank you for bringing that up. I would say the most important and valuable gift that you can give your students who are interested in exploring faith is to come out of the closet as a Christian on campus. Most of the faculty at the school where I worked who did attend a church or a synagogue kept this a secret. And this is not helpful to students. And it's not helpful to our national discourse where we want to live in a diverse country. So be open about this fact of yourself. And have a reading group would be fantastic. I think students would love it. I would also say that one of the ways that a polarization happens, which is so harmful to our culture right now, is if there is no Rowan Williams on campus, if you cannot bring Cornel West, if you cannot bring serious Christian thinkers who are liberal in the traditional sense of the word, then guess who represents Christianity? Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump, right? You know, you have this lovely strawman. You have seeded the field of this very rich tradition to your intellectual lessers. So please come out, please have a reading group, please open up the conversation. The students are incredibly spiritual and they are interested in exploring spirituality. And I think it would be a great experience for them. Whether it's scripture or poems or, you know, Thomas Merton or whatever, just having a place where there's a safe place to talk about spirituality and to explore it is so great and so healthy for a campus community. And like you said, a very nice antidote to some of this extreme language around identity, because in Christianity, there is this teaching, right, that we are one human family. There is no male or female, slave or free. These are beautiful ideas, maybe hard to live up to, but definitely worth engaging with. So I just want to encourage you.
Reed.
Yeah, that last comment reminds me of the old time cafe culture. You know, from time to time since the Renaissance, large institutions, no matter what their nature, inevitably, by reason of human nature, corrupt. And the powers to be, the leaders of those institutions, start to work in their own interests at the expense of the customers of the institution. So this is a problem that shifts back and forth over generations. It's been going on at least since the 11th century. So what do you do about it? And you know, your main speaker, all your speakers have really spoken eloquently on this issue. And the cafe culture, you know, Samuel Johnson and his group being an example, find ways to circumvent the system, which is broken and has been broken, in my view, for the last 30 or 40 years. This is a growing problem. It's just reaching an apex now, to find ways to circumvent the problem. And this that I'm listening to, which I'm delighted to be part of and hear and learn from, is an example of it. You know, the cafe culture, the readers group, finding ways to circumvent the learning experience of students, give them an opportunity for other options. They can't be controlled, you know, by the professor, whether you be on the right or the left extreme, or by the faculty or by the administrators. And I guess that's a function of Hedgehog Review, and if it certainly seems to me it's fulfilling that function. and trying to remain independent of this colossal system that unfortunately is, in my view, destroying liberal education, particularly in the elite universities. Stripping the kids of their culture, their heritage, which includes many various parts, and whether they be minority or whites or Jewish or Hispanics or blacks, whatever, they're all being caught up in this thing.
Anna, comment or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's been, to your point that you just made, sir, there's been a lot of excellent journalism about the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, students and Gen Z who are not affiliated with any religious tradition. But I haven't seen a lot of journalism done on the fact that you can't choose something that is not on the shelf, right? So we don't make our choices in a vacuum. If there is no reading group, if there is no service in the chapel, if there's no mass, there's no poster for mass, what choice is there? If to assume an identity is to lose the respect of your peers, is that a real choice, right? So we act as if these students are just doing this thing in a vacuum, but if you're in a grocery store and they don't have the product on the shelf, right? If there's no courses in the religion department which treat religion respectfully as a living thing, then you can't study it. So these are the kind of things I would love to explore in further essays about some of the problems with academic study of religion on campus, where there isn't really the option to learn more about your Jewish identity if that isn't available in any of the courses or any of the reading groups, etc.
I'm looking around to see if there are any mysterious hands that I've missed. Liz, Betsy.
Hi, Elizabeth Lash Quinn. Are you talking to me? I don't want to talk over.
I am talking to you.
Okay.
Elizabeth
I couldn't recognize which of the names.
Who is a fellow of the Institute and tuning in from New York State.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that this is a fantastic piece. I loved reading it. And it just spoke to so many of the concerns that I think many of us have now. I teach at Syracuse University, but if I were not a senior fellow at the Institute, I don't know what I would do, because it would definitely feel like living in a mad world. It's a recipe for insanity. And coming to an event like this, I share what the previous speaker said about the feeling of circumventing some of the real, sort of falling bricks. It feels like bricks falling on top of one. The conformity, the conformism, and lack of real intellectual engagement and dialogue, and stamping out of whole, peoples, as groups, as individuals, etc. So it's a real thing. I face it every day. I faced it through 3 decades as a professor. And that feeling of being somewhere in the center, even if you're not actually in the center, but wanting to have and having people on both sides that you think are valuable to engage with, but they will not engage with each other. It's really 2 different worlds, completely opposed. And what one set of people say enrages the other, and then it goes back and forth, and then everyone else is sort of left to their own devices. And it's a very dangerous situation. That's the situation we're living in socially, culturally, intellectually. So it's really important what you're doing. I wrote a couple of books that relate to all of these things. 20 years ago, I wrote a critique of diversity training. And I saw these things happening then. This was 20 years ago. And it's called Race Experts. And it questions the whole idea of these self-appointed race experts who are out there teaching us all what we're supposed to think. And it's really to great chagrin that I see this all coming back. And people now writing me and saying, your book is so relevant. How did you know this 20 years ago? Well, I was hoping that was the end of it. I didn't want anything to be relevant now. So I think what Malloy is doing, what you are doing, really trying to put your finger on what's happening and what different ways of thinking are, is what we have to do. But I was wondering, how do you keep your spirits up? Because I don't like the idea that the only way that you could keep your spirits up is to leave that situation. So what are you thinking of doing now? Freelancing mainly, or I mean, you're above a furniture store. Are you working as a craftsperson in, I mean, not a furniture store, but a craft shop, right? That was kind of enchanting to find a little detail there. Are you part of that artisanal production there associated with it? So I'm just wondering what's next.
Thank you. Yeah. My husband and I own a handmade furniture studio called Keating Woodworks, and yeah, we live above it and raise our family, so that's keeping us pretty busy. And yeah, I hope to just continue to write. It's a frightening time to be a writer on these issues, which you understand as someone who's written about them. But I think that the way you show respect to someone's ideas is to take them very seriously. And it troubles me to see so many of my fellow progressives not only not read the books, but just say, yes, of course, I completely agree with every aspect of your project. That's not respecting someone's thought. That's not engaging with their project in any kind of serious way. And I am surprised to see that. So I just hope more people will actually read and engage with these ideas and so we can have a better conversation about how to implement them. Because if you've lived in a college where they were implemented, you can see that there's some challenges there for people of faith and others. So I appreciate your kind words and encouragement. I hope to just keep writing and thinking about these ideas and other ideas, but it can be a little bit intimidating given the current climate.
I'm sorry, Mary Butler. I don't know whether you were trying to raise your hand earlier. No, okay. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't misread your signals. I'm looking for other signals from across the board, the chessboard. Anna, one of the things that I found, one of the many things that I found troubling was the students who actually reported discomfort about being identified as Catholic or possibly even as Jewish. But it is, I mean, were these rare instances, or would you say there were, I know it's hard to make assessments out of anecdotes, but do you think there is, people used to say one of the allowable prejudices in America is anti-Catholicism. Is that a continuation of that kind of, attitude? Or is this something new? Or are people feeling a new kind of vulnerability in identifying themselves as Catholic? Because, in some ways, Catholicism, you might say, has never been more institutionally triumphant. Look for one place at the Supreme Court. So I am a little surprised to hear some of your students saying that they really were unpopular or would have been less popular if people had known that they were Catholic.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it is. It's never been cool to be Catholic. I've been Catholic my whole life. It's never been cool, right? It's an acceptable prejudice. And I went into this job knowing that. I didn't expect it to be cool. But I think it is a new thing to say, Catholicism is evil. This is an interesting move. So moral relativism was kind of the norm on campus for a long time, which is the idea that there's no better or worse culture. And I think Kendi tries to believe that in his work. But moral relativism is really hard to sustain because people like hierarchies. I don't know why. It's a human tendency to rank. And there are these neat little hierarchies that have been given to students in intersectionality, right, of better or worse cultures. So, for example, the explosion in students identifying as Buddhist, right? Like Western culture is racist and white supremacist. It confers privilege. Eastern culture is good. It does not confer privilege. Well, of course, then if I'm a student who's seeking a spiritual practice, meditation is going to look good to me. I'm not saying that all of this is happening on a conscious level. It's probably an unconscious level, but the idea that Buddhism is good and non-judgmental and Christianity is bad and judgmental is just openly expressed all across campus, that Western ideas are bad and harmful, and that in order to correct for the power imbalance, we need to elevate non-Western ideas. If you read a lot of, I don't know if you've read a lot about decolonization, but if you read the literature, it's very open. One of the causes of climate change, according to people who are interested in decolonization, is monotheism. You know, that surprised me. I'm interested in that. That's a truth claim. I mean, so I'm interested in truth claims, but it did surprise me, I have to admit, to see monotheism as the cause of climate catastrophe. So there's a lot of embedded values and truth claims just all across the university that are just openly expressed. So it's not a relativistic environment anymore. You're making some big, bold truth claims about better or worse value systems, and a lot of things that you would be surprised get brought into this conversation about racial justice. The traditional family, Christianity, capitalism, a lot of ideas that would seem not necessarily related to the kind of changes that we need to make our society less racist are kind of lumped in. So I think you'd be surprised, depending on how seriously you take the books and the literature, how seriously you are committed to decolonization, for example, it might mean something like monotheism is a problem, depending on how seriously you take these texts. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I thought a point that Laura Ford brought up was important, was worth considering. And she was saying, well, it's not just the administrators. And also administrators are operating under the sort of fear of running afoul of the law, that there are more and more sort of potential legal situations there in universities. And I know one of our contributing writers here, Patrick Deneen, who I don't know if you know his work, but certainly a very conservative politically and religiously Catholic, and but has written a very good book on sort of the problems of liberalism. And one of them that he instances in his book is that as universities have lost any sort of normative culture, that, you know, a sort of assumed normative culture, which governed all sorts of things, including relations between the sexes and just civil behavior, the more we have had to legislate to rule by stipulating every situation. And I could recount some crazy stipulations that we at the university have been subjected to in some of these sort of HR kind of forms that we have, or tests that we're supposed to take. And you really see that this is an endless game, because there are endless situations in which legal questions might arise. And it seems that we are set on a kind of fatal or fateful logic. I just wonder, I see John Owen is raising his hand, and I don't want to lose him before he goes off in Canada. So John, don't respond to my question or comment, but John, go ahead.
Yeah, no fear, Jay. I could not answer your question.
No. Oh, you're not allowed to. That's right.
No. Okay. Good. Anna, listen. Thank you. This is terrific. I want to extend some of the questions and discussion just by, in particular, what Laura Ford said about litigation. And I chaired my department. I teach at UVA, though I am in Canada at the moment. But and so was an administrator for a while, and so know something of how that works from a departmental standpoint. Dealt with deans and so on. And it strikes me, I have kids of college age. Also, Joe Davis is on the call, so I'm gonna play Joe Davis for a minute. I understand that a lot of the students really do feel as a trauma, physically, as a trauma, what 2 generations ago, 3, when I was coming along, we would have felt as an annoyance or maybe something to ignore or to speak up about, but to let sort of roll off your back and move on from. And I don't mean the students are making it up. I think, so however this works in terms of social psychology, so a student hearing the N-word, that's never been, so I'm 58, I grew up in the South. I was taught never to say the word, but it wasn't a trauma to hear it. It was just impolite, something I'd better not do or my parents would get mad at me, that sort of thing. And now I think it really is qualitatively different. I think it is felt as a trauma. And so administrators are dealing with that situation. And that seems to be behind, my hunch is that's behind the emphasis on wellness, but there really are wellness issues to deal with, and bureaucratization, routinization, flattening, as was mentioned before. So I wonder what your reflections are on how to get, if we agree this is not great for colleges, this is not what we have meant as a, higher education, as you've said, is not supposed to be consistent this primarily. We're supposed to stretch our students. Students should want to be stretched, et cetera, et cetera. What is the way, how would you advise administrators? I mean, in a way that they could actually respond to, that they could see the point to, that they might see some reforms. Because I just have a real fear that this is going to go on for many, many more years.
That's a hard question. Thank you for your question. That's a hard question. I mean, the psychological data is real that there's an increase in anxiety and depression. There's a huge need for counseling departments. There's a huge need for wellness. All those things are great and helpful. There's a lot of data that spiritually healthy spirituality, growing up in a healthy spirituality, whether it's Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc., is great for kids and their resilience. I wish I could think of the author. I'll have to link to it in the chat. She's done a lot of incredible work on that. So I think that taking students from their home place and stripping them of any kind of connection to that could itself be part of that trauma. I had a student who was first generation. He was Hispanic and indigenous. We were reading the Bible. And I said, did anything come up for you in the reading? Did anything strike you? And he said, it just felt so good to hear the Bible again. I haven't heard it read since I was home with my parents. So I think that is part of it for some students, is it's a profoundly dislocating experience going to college and to have to learn a whole new way of thinking when you have to abandon your traditional way of thinking. So these are tons of issues that are, very complicated. But one of my concerns with wellness, and this is kind of just a critique of capitalism in general, is that if you constantly ask women, for example, do you feel okay with your body? Do you like your body? Do you feel ready for summer? You can actually induce in someone body issues. So one of my concerns with wellness is that we can do the same thing. We can constantly say, are you sleeping enough? Are you eating enough? Are you drinking enough water? Are you feeling balanced? Are you journaling? Are you grateful? No, I am not. By the time you've asked me the 10th time, I'm feeling very anxious, right? And now, boom, here comes capitalism with a product to sell you for the very feelings that it has induced in you, right? So we have signs all over campus, are you doing everything right? Are you meditating? Are you resting? Are you blah, 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 blah? How's your stress? And by the 10th time someone asks you that, you think, well, no, I'm pretty freaking stressed. So sometimes I think we create a problem and then we come in with the solution instead of just allowing students to kind of be and say, hey, we're here if we need you, but you're probably doing okay. What if we had signs on campus that say, you're doing a great job? You know, you're probably doing a lot better than you think you are. It's going to be okay. Instead of, you know, kind of creating an anxiety in them and then coming in with the resources that meet that anxiety that we've helped to create. Does that make sense? So in the same way that we don't allow, you know, evangelicals to proselytize on campus because that feels like pushy, we are kind of pushing a psychological way of looking at everything of, you know, that kind of language of trauma is very pushed. I brought out a speaker and there was like, this is going to be traumatic for students. That wasn't coming from students. So I don't know. These are complicated issues, and we definitely need to support the emotional and psychological well-being of students. But I do sometimes worry that the way that we do it can be actually creating it, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. I mean, you're pointing, if I could just, you're pointing to, there's probably a problem with, say, the pharmaceutical industry who, you know, the more Xanax prescriptions, the better, and so on. But there's also a cultural problem, don't you think? I mean, the way wellness is done, it's just assumed, hey, we need to have this at top of mind for people, or else there's something wrong. They will go wrong if we don't have this, and they need to attend to themselves and take care of themselves and so on. It sounds like what you're saying is wellness, okay, but better, done in a better way that actually fosters wellness.
Right.
Is that fair?
Absolutely. So wellness is important, but constantly thinking about yourself can cause you to feel bad. So, for example, if you're feeling sad, what might make you feel better would be to go do something for someone else, right? That's what religion teaches. Go repair the world. So instead of sitting around saying, why am I so sad? You might go volunteer at a homeless shelter, right? You might feel better. So kind of doing something positive instead of just focusing on the negative, which a very therapeutic model can sometimes do. Therapy is very valuable. I'm not against therapy. I'm just saying sometimes with students, we are so afraid of them being in an uncomfortable situation that we can create the anxiety that we are trying to treat. So for example, at the college where I was working, we closed our soup kitchen, right? Because students would not be safe, because it turns out that some homeless people have criminal records. Students are safe. They can give someone a sandwich. This is not harmful to them. It is helpful to their emotional well-being. It is unbelievable clear on the data that helping other people makes you feel better, right? So we don't need to protect students so much that then when they do encounter difference, for example, a homeless person, they are very anxious because they've never encountered that kind of difference before. And in fact, encountering more difference, then you build the resilience and you become more capable of dealing with those anxiety-producing situations.
Thank you.
I don't know if Joe has any specific insights. Joe Davis, who is on the staff here at the Institute and runs his own program on the self. Joe, do you have any thoughts to throw in here? As a practicing Catholic who's managed to survive.
Yeah. No, I just want to second or third everything that Anna just said. That seems to me like we have a tremendous problem of where we're focused on all our deficiencies. We pathologize and pathologize and pathologize. And I think ultimately that reflects a deeply problematic conception of ourselves, right? Of ourselves as human persons. And we always seem to move in one direction, and that's toward more pathology and more need for expert intervention, less self-efficacy, and so on. I think that's exactly what Anna was getting at, and I think that's exactly right. And what's needed, right, is for young people to, which we don't do very much of, is give them a sense that they're actually needed, right? That they do have self-efficacy. They can affect things and change things. We have a way of teaching them to just focus on themselves and their careers and so on. And I think that's actually very enervating and often gives them a sense that they don't have anything to offer or anything meaningful to do or say, and so on. Every time a hardship comes up, automatic tendency is to make things easier for them, right? To back away, to drop the standards and so on. And so on. Anyway, so that's just to, I think, reiterate what Anna's already said, and it seems to me is just right. I wanted to, if I can, transition to a question I had, which I think picks up on your point, or the question you were asking, Jay, had to do with liberalism. And I'm sorry, I tuned in really late, so the trouble with Zoom is I forget to actually do it. Was the question about, it seemed like she was saying, Anna was saying that, it used to be a kind of more relativistic, kind of tolerant, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We won't impose a single, that seems to me liberalism, where there was no single conception of the good. And so we would allow for a certain kind of pluralism. And in colleges, it seems to me, we're, as liberal institutions, really tried to embody that. And so on. But that seems to me precisely the thing that's kind of gone away. So it doesn't seem to me like we have a, strictly speaking, a problem with liberalism here. It seems like something new is on the horizon. It's precisely not liberal. And again, maybe you've already talked about that and I missed it, but I would want to ask if Anna has thoughts about that. Like, what is this new thing? Because it does seem it's can be remarkably intolerant and illiberal, rather than a kind of offshoot of liberalism or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. I touched on it briefly in the article. I like Wesley Yang's, he calls it the successor ideology, just because it's difficult to name. It's the successor to liberalism, and it encompasses a lot of different things that have begun in the academy and then have sort of filtered down into the culture. Critical race theory, all of this stuff that we've been talking about, it comes from a number of areas. I think that it's basically that nature abhors a vacuum, and relativism or liberalism is very hard to sustain. And people want to know who's good and who's bad, who's in and who's out. I mean, it's just a very strong human tendency, unfortunately. And that's part of the reason I think we should have students study religion. You can learn a lot from these errors in religion as well, this tendency to sanctimony, persecution of outsiders, banning books. We have tried all of these things before. It didn't work out very well for us, but good luck if that's the path you want to go down. I don't recommend it, but it's been done before. Quotas for Jewish students, nothing new, right? There's no new ideas, but they're just popping up in new iterations. And I think there is, yes, a very strong illiberal sense on the left. And I think there's a fear on the left, I understand it as a liberal, to criticize these things, because it seems, well, you can't criticize it because it gives power to conservatives or gives power to the right. But we have to criticize it if it's problematic. We must criticize it. We must speak about it. If it's true, if this is what's really happening, we have to talk about it. Who cares? Right? The truth will have its day. That's what I say. So, but yes, it's I would call it the successor ideology, and it's coming up in a lot of places where there's a lack of tolerance of or even of debate. So I wanted to bring out speakers and have them debate, and I was told that was not allowed. And I thought that was a major change from what I experienced in college. And if you look at speakers like Kendi, he will not debate, and he will not even be on a panel. And other people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, etc. And then old school liberals who are also committed to racial justice, people like Cornel West, are committed to debate. They do debates, they appear on panels, and they're criticized by their younger, I guess, peers or colleagues for doing that. So that's kind of an example of the illiberalism I think we're seeing.
Yeah, I think, there are so many strains in liberalism that can be extended to the point of what's called successor ideology. But I think one of them that you might have missed Anna talking about, Joe, earlier, was the way the managerial ethos has, combined with the therapeutic ethos, has so suffused our institutional life today that everything has to be made manageable. And that anything that is potentially, just as you were saying earlier, that tests a person, that pushes a person, is potentially harmful and therefore unmanageable. And that ethos, I think, really needs to be endlessly challenged by humanists, by people who whether they're religious or non-religious humanists, is that, management cannot take away, but we've seen this, of course, in the overmanagement of young children's lives. And when you get the turn against it in places like Germany, where parents pay money to send their children off to be wild, for a chance to be wild, instead of, they're having their parents arrested, as a Chevy Chase, Maryland set of parents were arrested because their children were allowed to walk on the streets unattended by adult supervision. Obviously there's some hard calls here, but we have given free license to the managers of the world to control everything, and that must be resisted. And I don't think that is a partisan position, left or right. I think it is a human position. It is a position of what I would call the radical center. Give us a chance to fail. Give us a chance to fall down, as you were saying so eloquently, Anna. I know we've kept you here for a long time, and I hear the furniture groaning downstairs, waiting to be finished. But unless there's, do we have enough? I don't see. There was one comment that a panelist made, written comment. I think I should ask that, which is from Charlie Wu. Or is that Charlie? Yeah. Charlie Woodruff. Woodleaf. I'm sorry. Sorry to mangle your name. I only saw part of it on the chat line. Do you think there's any noteworthy distinction between the framework of anti-racism as articulated by Kendi or D'Angelo on the one hand, and as implemented by college administrators on the other? Are administrators simply importing the ideas they apply, or do they modify the intellectual edifice before deploying it? For example, Kendi writes in his book, "I cannot disconnect my parents' religious strivings to be Christian from my secular strivings to be anti-racist." This quotation makes me wonder if the hostility toward religious identity you describe stems in part from a divide between theory and practice. Apologies for the facelessness. My mic and camera are broken. Did you hear that? Was that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood it though.
He is saying, is there a difference between the theory of the writings of people like Kendi and the application of them by bureaucracies and administrations? And then he read the fact that, he himself, Kendi, received, his own sort of motivation to strive for justice from his mother's Christian convictions. In other words, is something lost in the implementation of these theories by administrators?
I think if you read Kendi's book, I would disagree slightly that he kind of has a reverse conversion story of leaving behind Christianity and kind of awakening to the reality that the way to change the world is through political power. And that was really common. If you're in an evangelical space, for example, there's always kind of this story of I was sinning and then this thing happened and I, found God or something. And that kind of reverse story was very common in the religion department, which I worked with as well. I grew up in the Black church. One professor would kind of share his testimony, and I was a rising star and I was going to be a preacher. And then I realized that Christianity was rotten to the core. And now I'm an academic. And that's this kind of awakening moment that Kendi has and others have. Robin DiAngelo doesn't touch on religion at all. Not to say everyone who's working in anti-racism is anti-religious, but I would say Kendi kind of is a secular person and thinker. And I do think the idea is, at least at the college where I was working, that the student body makeup cannot differ in any way from the percentage of the US racially or ethnically did come from Kendi. But I will say that those ideas were inconsistently applied, which was one of my problems. So for example, Buddhists are 1% of the US population, Jews are 1% to 2%, Buddhists are 1%. In elite campuses, there are tons of Buddhists or people who are Buddhist interested in Buddhism, beautiful religion, but no one was saying we have too many Buddhists, right? So it was kind of inconsistently applied, even though the theory was there that we should have, the culture should be, an exact makeup, it should represent the US exactly. And then you also just run into problems with implementation. So for example, if you're a very progressive college campus, observant Muslims are not going to want to come there. There's no single-sex dorms. There's a lot of, cultural differences. So those are some of the things where you're trying to apply Kindi's ideas and you run into problems, either because your campus is a place that's just more welcoming to secular students, and so you're not going to get a bunch of observant Muslim students, or that you are saying, in theory, we want an exact representation of groups that matches the US population, but in practice, you're kind of actually discriminating against certain groups and not others. You're only applying it sometimes. Does that make sense? And so that kind of became a problem for me too, is that if you have a rule, at least you should apply it, consistently.
I hope that answers Charlie's question. Thank you again, Anna. Obviously, this is a topic that we hope you go on to explore, because you bring to it both the intellectual familiarity with the ideas, but just as important, if not more important, the sort of personal experience of how this is playing out in institutions of higher learning. And I think very modestly, you have set forth some possible ways forward, some ways of resisting the automaticity, it seems, of this takeover of sort of administrative behavioral control policies. And it's put us all, I think, to thinking about these things. So I want to thank you very much, first of all, for contributing to the Hedgehog Review. Second of all, for joining us today, and really thank you for the work you've done. Clearly, you are an inspiring leader, and I hope that higher education has not lost you permanently. So I join others here. I hope one day we can meet in person instead of this horrible, Anna and I were talking about this earlier. He said, yes, Zoom has made a lot possible, but it has also become the symbol, the emblem of this terrible time in our global lives. But it would be nice, one day to be in person with a lot of these people here, rather than just as a professor here at the Institute calls it, seeing all of these passport photos in front of him as he teaches his classes. But thank you all for joining us in this virtual medium, and we will see you soon. Take care, Anna.
Thank you so much.